Sometimes the heaviest luggage isn't weighed in pounds. It's measured in memories. At Gate C17, an old man with a trembling hand stood quietly, ready to board a flight to a reunion of men who once stood shoulder to shoulder in war. But the weight he carried wasn't just in his duffel bag. It was in the names of the fallen, in promises made in snow-covered foxholes, and in decades of silence he never expected the world to understand. When a gate agent coldly dismissed his story for 6 extra pounds, something extraordinary happened. A voice rose, not just to defend him, but to reveal who he really was. What started as a moment of quiet humiliation became a breathtaking revelation that rippled through a crowded terminal, uniting strangers in respect, compassion, and tears. This isn't just a story about a soldier. It's about memory, dignity, and a son's quiet return, not just to his father, but to the truth they both carried in silence. Stay with us, because what happens next will leave you breathless. And just maybe, it will remind you to look again at the people we too often overlook. The agent's eyes barely flicked toward the screen. "That'll be $60, sir." Oversized. Policy is policy. The words hit like a slap, sharp, cold, uncaring. Her tone had that familiar blend of repetition and detachment, like she'd said the line 100 times that day alone. Frank Connelly, 84 years old, stood there gripping the worn strap of his canvas duffel bag. His fingers, lined and slightly trembling, curled around the fabric like it held more than belongings, like it anchored him. To everyone else around, he was just another elderly traveler in an airport crowd that didn't look up from their phones. But inside that bag were the silent remnants of a lifetime. A neatly folded flag, a weathered uniform, and the memories of brothers he'd lost long ago. "I was hoping maybe an exception," he said quietly, his voice soft but steady. The agent let out a sigh. Everyone thinks their bag's important. $60 or it doesn't fly. He paused, not because of the money. It wasn't about that. It was the feeling, the slow erosion of dignity, of being told that what he carried, what it meant, didn't matter. With a quiet breath, he reached for his wallet. Then a voice cut through the noise behind him. Calm, steady, clear. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The terminal seemed to pause. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Everything shifted in that instant. Frank didn't react with surprise. He simply turned his head slowly, as if he'd heard voices like that before. In foxholes, in command tents, on radios buzzing through static. And then he moved, not with speed but with deliberation. There was purpose in every step, not weakness. At 84, his back remained mostly straight, his chin lifted, not with arrogance but with quiet strength. The creases etched into his skin weren't signs of age, but of endurance. Wind, rain, time. They had carved those lines with reverence. His hair, still mostly silver and neatly parted, framed eyes that once scanned jungle ridgelines and frozen hillsides for movement. Now they simply searched the overhead screen for Gate 17. Frank had served in the Korean War. A soldier from a time that most today knew only from black and white documentaries or history class glossovers. He never spoke of it unless someone asked. He wasn't a man to brag, but this trip was different. He was flying to Texas, headed toward a reunion that was both a celebration and a farewell. 70 years had passed since he and the other members of his unit had first stood side by side in training. Young and unsure, but united. Now the few who still lived were gathering again, this time at a war memorial near San Antonio. That olive duffel bag at his side, it didn't carry electronics or travel pillows. It carried pieces of his soul. Inside, wrapped carefully like sacred objects, were 3 things: the American flag that had once draped over the coffin of his closest friend, a bundle of yellowed love letters addressed to the woman he never got to marry, and a velvet-lined box holding his bronze star, its surface still gleaming after all these years. Beneath them, his old uniform jacket pressed neatly, the one he hadn't worn in decades. But he brought it. Of course he did, because this wasn't luggage. It was memory. Frank didn't ask for help. He never had, even with the stiffness creeping into his knees and the subtle shake in his right hand, he carried his own weight, literally and otherwise. When someone offered to grab the bag at the curb, he just gave a polite nod. "I've got it, thanks." It wasn't pride exactly, it was instinct, a lifelong reflex built from discipline and duty. He wasn't loud, but when he spoke, people stopped and listened. There was a tone in his voice that made even the most distracted pause. Not barked orders, just clarity, strength. Even strangers, rideshare drivers, baggage clerks, kids in line, sensed something about him. They didn't always know what, but they felt it. Frank wasn't flying for nostalgia. He wasn't chasing the past. He was honoring it. He was going not just for himself, but for those who never came back. He carried not just a bunion, but the names of friends engraved on cold stone. He carried the silence of their last breaths and the promise he made when they were still alive. "If I make it out, I'll remember you." And he had, every single day. Gate C17 buzzed with the usual low-level chaos. Too many people, not enough space. Delays echoed over the loudspeakers. Gate changes scrolled across the monitors. Most travelers stared blankly into their phones like lifelines. But Frank stood still, at the counter, his duffel beside him, waiting. "Name?" the young woman behind the counter asked flatly, eyes never leaving her screen. "Connelly, Frank Connelly," he answered. Clicking filled the air as Agent Brianna typed quickly, without emotion. Her dark hair was tied back in a tight bun, and her blazer looked freshly pressed. But her tone didn't match the polish. Casual, distracted. "All right, Mr. Connelly, one carry-on?" she asked, finally glancing up. He gave a small nod and placed the olive bag gently on the scale. Frank's expression shifted, barely, but just enough to betray the quiet sting behind his eyes, as the number blinked across the screen. "You're over by 6 pounds, the agent said flatly. "That'll be $60. He glanced down at the duffel bag resting near his feet. For a second, his fingers hesitated near the handle. There was a softness in his voice when he looked back up. "Ma'am, this isn't just a bag. I'm heading to a military reunion. There are personal items in there." Brianna didn't blink. She gave a shrug, her tone distant and automatic. "Sir, everyone says that. If I make an exception for one person, I have to do it for everyone." Frank gave a gentle nod. "I understand," he said quietly. "I just thought maybe—" Before he could finish, she cut in with a rehearsed smile. "Policy is policy." Behind him, someone let out a loud, irritated sigh. Another voice muttered under their breath, just loud enough, "Come on, old man. Some of us have places to be." Frank didn't react, not visibly. He just held the handle of his bag a little tighter, like letting go might cost him more than a fee. Then a younger male employee strolled past with a coffee in hand. He slowed as he passed the counter, eyeing the scene without much interest. "Overweight?" he asked Brianna. She nodded. He chuckled. "Rules are rules, Grandpa." And then he walked on without a second glance. Frank didn't flinch, but something inside him did, something deep and old. He looked down again at the worn bag, his hands trembling slightly. Not from age, not from anger, from memory. In his mind, the noise of the terminal faded. The cold linoleum floor became slush. The hum of intercoms turned into a howling wind slicing through the mountains of Korea. He was 19 again. His boots soaked, the cold eating through layers. And beside him, Private Tommy Reynolds had stopped moving. Frank had shouted at him, begged him to get up, to keep walking. But Tommy never did. His eyes remained open, blank, unmoving, as snowflakes settled on his lashes. Then Sergeant Kelly appeared, hauling a wounded man across jagged terrain, blood soaking through his pants, still barking orders through the screams and gunfire. And that smell, gunpowder, blood, frozen dirt, it never left. Back at Gate C17, Brianna tapped her pen on the counter. "Sir, card or cash?" Frank looked up slowly. His eyes were far away and focused all at once. "Those boys," he said. "They never made it home. I carry them with me. That bag, that uniform, it's for them." Brianna's reply came quickly, almost robotic. "I'm sorry for your service, but the weight policy still applies." Frank took in a slow breath. The air was thick with the scent of cinnamon pretzels and jet fuel. He reached carefully into his jacket. Each movement felt deliberate, weighted, like lifting more than just his arm. The line behind him shifted. A teenage girl rolled her eyes and whispered something to her mom. A man in a polo glanced at his Apple Watch and sighed loud enough to be heard 2 gates down. Frank's fingers touched the leather edge of his wallet, but he didn't pull it out right away. "I don't mind paying," he said gently. "I just didn't think I'd have to explain why it matters." For a split second, something softened in Brianna's eyes, but she glanced over his shoulder at the growing line and cleared her throat. "We just need to keep this moving, sir." And then came the final sting. "Maybe next time, pack lighter, Grandpa." Frank didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His mind drifted again, to a foxhole under a crackling sky. Artillery rumbled in the distance. In his hand, a folded letter from home he'd never opened. A promise from a girl who eventually stopped writing. He had kept that letter with him for weeks, untouched, unread, somehow sacred. He remembered thinking, if I make it home, I'll never complain about the small stuff. And now here he was, not defending a bag, but something else entirely. A weight that couldn't be measured in pounds, a burden of memory, of loyalty. Back in the terminal, Frank finally opened his wallet. He pulled out a card, extended it slowly toward Brianna. She reached for it. But before their hands touched, a voice echoed across the terminal. Deep, calm, steady. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" Everything stilled. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The shuffle of the line came to a halt. And for the first time, Brianna's practiced posture faltered. Frank didn't speak. He remained still, the card still in his hand. But his eyes moved toward the voice. And in that fragile, suspended moment, something shifted in Gate 17. Because Frank Connelly wasn't just an old man delaying a line. He was a survivor, a keeper of memories, a quiet witness to sacrifices that no one in that terminal could fully grasp. And now, after all this time, he was about to be remembered. Frank Connelly stood at Gate C17, but his mind was somewhere far away. So far, it felt like a lifetime. The overhead lights blinked in soft pulses, their glow filtered through the fog of memory. His fingers hovered over his wallet, suspended in a moment that no longer belonged to the present. It wasn't about boarding passes or security lines or overpriced coffee from shops behind him. It was about something colder, sharper. It was winter. But not this sanitized, fluorescent-lit kind of winter. No, it was Korea. The kind of winter that sliced through layers of fabric and skin, that burned lungs with every breath, turning exhale into frost even before it left your lips. He was 19 again. Crouched low in a foxhole dug into the frozen slope near the eastern ridge of the Chosin Reservoir, Frank could feel the steel of his rifle stiff and dead in his hands, its metal colder than death itself. The wind screamed through the mountains with a hatred that seemed personal. Shards of ice clung to the rim of his helmet, like teeth waiting to bite. Beside him, Private First Class Walter Hutchkins, Lucky, grinned, unaffected, like the bitter wind was just another joke in a world full of them. Lucky never earned his nickname for dodging bullets, though he had done that too. It came from a dented little tin of poker chips he kept tucked in the inside pocket of his uniform. He always said it reminded him life was just one big gamble, one long bluff waiting to be called. Then everything fell apart. It started with a single shot, one sharp, lonely crack. Then a scream, then gunfire erupted from the ridgeline, and the night became chaos. Orange muzzle flashes sparked like fireflies in a nightmare. The Chinese had used the blizzard as cover, creeping in close beneath the storm's howl. Frank remembered diving for cover, somebody shouting, "Incoming!" The snow rose up to meet him, and he fired blindly into the dark beyond the tree line. He couldn't see, couldn't hear. Just flashes, noise, the echo of fear, and the rhythm of survival. He turned, barely registering his surroundings, just in time to see Lucky rise to a knee and fire 3 rounds into the void. Buying time for Frank. That gave him the seconds he needed to crawl forward to new cover. But then, a movement to the left, a shadow, a shape. It would have been his end. He knew it. But Lucky threw himself in between, without hesitation, without a word. The blast slammed Frank backwards. His ears rang, his mouth filled with ice and dirt. When he came to, Lucky's body was crumpled beside him, blood melting the snow beneath him. The tin of poker chips had burst open, chips scattered like broken dreams on the white canvas. Frank screamed, called his name, but Lucky didn't answer. His eyes stared unmoving, still, gone. They held the line that night. Reinforcements arrived as dawn lit the shattered trees. When the sun finally crested the hills, Frank knelt beside what was left of his friend, the snow crusting around them like an unfinished grave, and made a vow with shaking hands. "If I make it home, you will not be forgotten. Not ever." And he kept that vow. He carried it home with him, through decades of silence, reunions, the heavy grief of folded flags, and the echo of names etched in stone. The promise had never faded. It lived in his bone. Back in the airport, reality returned slowly, like a curtain rising. The carts beeped, announcements buzzed through tinny speakers. Passengers shuffled forward. But Frank wasn't quite there anymore. Not fully. The duffel bag at his side carried more than metals and fabric. It carried Lucky and all the others. It carried names carved not just in granite in D.C., but into his very soul. This trip to Texas wasn't just for a reunion. Not anymore. Each year, fewer chairs stayed filled. Frank knew it might be his turn to stand and read the names aloud this time. To be the last witness. The final voice breaks. He looked down at the bag and whispered, so soft no one heard it but himself. "I haven't forgotten you, Lucky. I never will." The words lingered in the air. He exhaled, a quiet breath that carried more than just oxygen. It carried the weight of decades. His wallet still hung open in his hand. His fingers trembled. Not from age, but from something deeper, something harder to name. Not fear, not bitterness, closer to shame. Not for who he had lived with honor, with resilience forged in blood and frost. But here, now, at this gate, being nickel and dimed for a bag that bore the weight of sacrifice, it scraped at something sacred inside. Across the counter, the young gate agent, Brianna, stole a quick glance at the growing line behind him and gently cleared her throat. "Sir, I need to process the next passenger." Frank swallowed hard. "Card or cash?" "Card," he said quietly. He reached for it, the plastic cold and too light, not nearly enough to match what it stood for. As he tried to pull it from the leather slot, it caught on the edge. His fingers fumbled. The tremble worsened, not because of arthritis, but because of the sting of being treated like an inconvenience, like a delay in someone else's timeline. From behind someone's side, another voice muttered impatiently, "Come on." The world narrowed around him, shrinking to a single pinpoint. The bag, the counter, the chill in her voice. It all hit Frank at once, sharp and impersonal. Then, everything changed. He didn't hear anyone approach, didn't see the man move, but he felt it. The space behind him shifted like a hush before thunder breaks. The very air seemed to thicken, dropping in pitch. Brianna glanced up, startled. Her sentence faltered, unraveling in midair. From the crowd stepped a man, silent, composed, and magnetic in his presence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm authority stole the breath from the terminal. Heads turned, conversations died. Even the agent at the next counter froze mid-scan. He was tall, broad-shouldered, in a dark, sharply tailored civilian suit. No tie, no badge, no rank. But everything about the way he stood, the way his alert eyes scanned the room, said military, said discipline, said years served. And when he finally spoke, his voice had the weight of granite. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" It was like the air itself had tilted. Passengers who had been buried in screens were suddenly frozen, listening. The gate agent next to them had stopped entirely. Brianna straightened, her confidence unraveling. I'm sorry, sir," she stammered. "It's just our carry-on policy. His bag, it's overweight." But the certainty had drained from her tone. Her voice, earlier so rigid, now tripped over itself. The man didn't look at her. His focus was elsewhere. Softer now, searching. His eyes were locked on Frank. Frank turned slightly, eyes narrowed, puzzled. "Excuse me, sir," the man said, voice quieter now, almost gentle. "Might I ask your name?" Frank blinked. Frank Connelly. A breath passed, then the man's expression changed, just slightly. Recognition flickered behind his eyes. He stepped closer. "You served with the 27th Infantry, didn't you?" he asked. "Korea, winter of '51. Frank's brow tightened. "Yes, I did." The man's jaw set, emotion just beneath the surface. "My grandfather served with you," he said, voice low and steady. "He told me about the man who dragged him out of a foxhole. Said everyone else had run." He paused, letting the weight land. "He said he owed you his life." Something flared in Frank's eyes, a flicker of flame in the dark. The memory surged back. Fire, chaos, screams, the boy with the radio. "I remember," he whispered. "Mason. He had a picture of his little girl sewn into his collar." The man nodded slowly. "That little girl was my mother." He turned now, slowly facing Brianna. When he spoke again, the softness was gone. His voice edged with frost. "This man doesn't pay a cent. Not while I'm standing here." Silence settled like snowfall. Heavy, absolute. What had begun as a quiet, almost bureaucratic embarrassment had shifted. Something reverent filled the air. Something unspoken, but undeniable. The man stepped closer, and as he did, the tension in the room crystallized around him. Frank's eyes rose to meet him, then widened, but not because of the uniform, because of the face. "Jonathan," his voice cracked, half question, half memory, a tremble that carried more than just recognition. The man paused. For the first time in years, he met his father's eyes. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "It's me." Now fully visible, he stood in full Army service uniform, boots polished to a mirror shine, his decorations glinting under airport lights. 4 silver eagles on his shoulders left no doubt. Colonel Jonathan Connelly. He hadn't just wandered over. He had just arrived, stepping off a flight from Washington, D.C. minutes ago. He'd spotted the scene unfolding from across the terminal and froze where he stood. Frank's hand lingered near the counter, fingers still brushing the credit card. "I didn't know you were coming." "I wasn't supposed to," Jonathan replied. "Briefing got canceled last minute. Thought I'd surprise you at the reunion." A pause. Looks like the surprise went both ways. There was no warmth in his voice, but no resentment either. Just layers of time, of silence, of what once broke them. Frank shifted. "It's been a long time." "It has," Jonathan said, scanning his father's face, older now, smaller somehow, yet still unshaken. Behind them, Brianna stood stiffly. "Sir, Colonel, this passenger's bag." Jonathan didn't even glance her way. He lifted one hand, just a gesture, but it was enough. The whole gate went still. "This passenger," he said, voice calm and firm. Jonathan slowly turned to the crowd, his voice steady but full of something that made people stop and listen. "This man," he said, gesturing toward the quiet figure beside him, "is not just my father. He's Sergeant Frank Connelly of the 27th Infantry, Korea. He served under fire at the Chosin Reservoir. He carried wounded men across the ice, while enemy rounds cracked above his head." His words hit the air like cold steel. He earned the Bronze Star. He was cited for valor in 3 separate engagements, and he did it all without ever asking for a thank you. The terminal grew still. Even the usual hum of airport announcements seemed to fade as silence settled like snowfall. Jonathan turned back to his father, his voice now softer, more personal. "You used to say, I didn't do anything special. I just came home. But you did, Dad. You did a lot." Frank's eyes shimmered. He didn't speak, but something deep and wordless settled in the lines of his face. The emotion clung to him like frost, subtle, unmoving, impossible to ignore. Jonathan stepped closer, easing the worn green duffel bag from his father's shoulder. He held it gently in both hands, as if it were something sacred. "You carried all of us on your back for years," he said. "Let me carry something for you, for once." Frank blinked, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. His voice, when it came, was low and hesitant. "Thought you didn't want to talk anymore." Jonathan gave a quiet smile. "I didn't come here to talk. I came to stand beside you." Brianna, the gate agent, stammered from behind the counter. "Colonel, I didn't realize." You don't need to realize, Jonathan cut in, his tone calm but sharp as a blade. You just need to respect. He turned back to the other passengers, his voice rising slightly but never losing its control. This man should be flying first class, but he didn't ask for that. He only wanted to carry his memories with dignity. Frank looked down, unable to meet anyone's eyes, his expression overwhelmed. Jonathan reached out, laying a firm, grounding hand on his father's shoulder. You're not just my old man, he said quietly. You're the reason I wear this uniform. And in that moment, in a crowded, impatient airport terminal, Frank Connelly didn't feel like just another aging veteran trying to board a plane. He felt seen. He felt known, respected, understood. The silence lingered, heavy and unmoving, until something subtle began to shift. It started with Brianna. The sharpness she'd shown before drained from her features. Her posture loosened, her hands falling to her sides as her eyes dropped. Not to avoid, but to understand. She looked at the duffel bag now in Jonathan's grip like it had weight she hadn't noticed before. She opened her mouth, but no words came. There were none that would fit. Kevin, the young man who earlier had smirked and muttered about, "Our rules, Grandpa," shifted uncomfortably. The smugness was gone. Now he looked like he wanted to vanish behind the desk. Next to him, Mr. Delgado, the supervisor who had earlier dismissed it all as a minor delay, rushed forward, his voice now coated in regret. "Colonel," he began, nerves breaking through the professional tone, "on behalf of the airline, I'd like to—" Jonathan raised a hand, not angry, just firm. "No apologies needed," he said, "just a correction." Delgado nodded quickly. "Of course, yes, a correction." And then, like a match to dry kindling, something rippled through the terminal. A woman near the front of the boarding line, a middle-aged traveler with her elderly father, began to clap. Softly, slowly, unsure but full of intention. A few seats down, an older man in a faded leather bomber jacket rose and joined in. His eyes didn't leave Frank's face. One by one, the clapping spread. The passengers, who just moments before had been tired, irritated, impatient, were now standing, applauding, some with tears in their eyes. They didn't need to know every detail. They just understood the weight of what stood before them. Frank stood frozen. He looked around, overwhelmed by the unexpected tide of recognition. He tried to wave it off, to shake his head, but Jonathan leaned in again, his voice low and certain. "Don't brush it away," he whispered. "This is yours." From behind the counter, a young boy's voice suddenly rose above the noise. Clear, sincere, untouched by cynicism. "He's like a real-life Captain America." It wasn't meant to be dramatic. It was just honest, childlike awe. Frank turned toward the voice. The boy couldn't have been older than 9. He wore a faded backpack, his eyes wide, staring up at Frank like he was seeing a living legend. Because in a way, he was. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Frank Connelly smiled. It wasn't big or showy, just a gentle pull at the corners of his mouth. But it was real. It reached his eyes. He leaned ever so slightly toward the boy and said, "Shield," he said softly, as if the word carried the weight of everything he couldn't explain. "But I did what I could." The boy's face lit up, his eyes wide and shining. "That's even cooler," he whispered, full of awe. Around them, a quiet shift took place. Other passengers, stirred by the quiet gravity of the moment, pulled out their phones, not with the hunger for clicks or trending views, but to capture something real. A moment worth remembering, something they could one day show their children and say, "This is what respect looks like." Security had started to gather, alerted by the crowd forming near the gate. But when the officers noticed the uniforms and the reverence rippling through the group, they simply nodded in understanding and stepped back. Whatever was happening here, it didn't need their interruption. It needed space. Delgado returned with a wheelchair, but Frank gently refused. He stood tall, though his body protested. When he reached for his bag, Colonel Jonathan Connelly was already holding it, ready to carry it aboard. Frank tried to take it from him, but Jonathan shook his head with a quiet but firm smile. His grip tightened slightly around the handle. "It stays with me," he said. And so it did. They began walking together down the jet bridge, father and son, not just as travelers now, but as something more, something acknowledged, honored. Brianna stepped aside as they passed, her voice low, sincere. I'm sorry, Sergeant. Frank paused, looked at her with no bitterness. You didn't know, he said gently. Now you do. And then he moved on, head high, duffel bag untouched, memory restored. Behind them, the applause still echoed. But above all the clapping, there was a deeper sound, a quieter, fuller one, the sound of dignity being returned. Frank stepped slowly onto the jet bridge, each step carrying more than his weight. The wheels of time, for once, seemed to turn in his favor. This wasn't just boarding anymore. It felt like a ceremony. Beside him, Jonathan walked in sync. Not ahead, not behind, right beside him. One hand held the olive duffel with care, like a sacred artifact rather than an old bag. The other hand was free, open, offering support if needed. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. As they reached the plane, the flight attendants stood at attention near the cabin door. They had already been told. Their faces carried the gravity of the moment. One of them, a senior woman with soft lines on her face and streaks of gray in her hair, stepped forward. Her voice was warm, respectful. Welcome aboard, Sergeant Connelly. We're honored to have you. Frank gave a quiet nod. Just Frank is fine, he murmured. But Jonathan gently interrupted, his voice low but unmistakably firm. He earned that title. The flight attendant gave a gentle smile. Then, Sergeant, it is. They didn't head to the usual rows, packed tight near the engines. They were led to the front, to first class. Frank hesitated at the threshold. I didn't book this, he said under his breath. Jonathan didn't glance his way. Doesn't matter. At their seats, wide leather chairs with generous armrests and untouched champagne menus, Frank looked around, uneasy. The space felt too open, too polished. It didn't feel like his place. I should sit further back, he said quietly, almost to himself. Jonathan, placing the duffel gently into the overhead bin as if laying down something sacred, responded without turning. You've already spent your life sitting in the back. It's time you sat in the front. Frank let out a slow breath. Then carefully he lowered himself into the seat. The leather was too smooth, too quiet, too forgiving. But the dull ache in his knees reminded him. Maybe comfort wasn't a luxury anymore. Maybe it was earned. Jonathan took the seat beside him, adjusting the creases in his uniform with practiced fingers. They sat in silence for a while, surrounded by the soft hush of boarding announcements and the distant sounds of passengers settling into place. First class remained still, almost sacred. Finally, Frank spoke, voice low. You always blamed me, didn't you, for enlisting? Jonathan didn't look at him, but his voice came quietly. When Mom died, I was angry at everything. But yeah, I blamed you, for leaving when I needed someone, for choosing war over home. Frank nodded slowly. The words weren't easy, but they were true. I thought I was protecting something. Honor, country, duty. I didn't realize I was leaving behind a kid who needed his father more than the flag needed another soldier. For a long second, Jonathan said nothing. Then finally he turned to face his father. You were always a soldier to me, even at home. Always stiff, quiet, like you never really came all the way back. Frank swallowed, his throat thick. That's because some of me didn't. And for a moment, nothing moved. Not the plane, not the passengers, not even time. Frank and Jonathan sat quietly side by side, but this time the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was comforting, full of understanding and peace. A silence that had been earned, not endured. Jonathan glanced upward toward the overhead bin. I saw the old letters in there, he said quietly. Frank's lips curved into a faint smile. From Mom, he nodded. I never threw them away. Some things are worth keeping close. Outside the window, the engines roared to life, vibrating the cabin gently as the plane prepared for takeoff. A flight attendant leaned in with a practiced smile. Can I get you anything before we go up? Frank turned from the window to look at his son, then back again. I'm good, he replied softly. I've already got everything I need. Jonathan smiled faintly to himself, a quiet, inward kind of smile. Outside, the runway stretched ahead, long, clean, and open. For the first time in decades, it felt like their future stretched the same way. By the time the wheels of the plane touched down in Texas, Their story had already begun to travel. In the boarding area, an observant passenger had quietly recorded part of what happened at Gate C17, just enough to capture the moment Colonel Connelly stepped forward, the shocked hush that fell across the terminal, and the wave of respect as strangers rose and saluted Sergeant Frank Connelly. The video went viral in hours. News outlets across the country picked it up. Veteran humiliated at gate until a colonel stepped in. Honor delayed, then delivered. The Frank Connelly story. The public backlash was immediate. The airline scrambled to respond. By morning, they had issued a formal apology. We extend our sincerest apologies to Sergeant Frank Connelly and his family. This moment has reminded us of the critical importance of honoring those who have served. We are implementing mandatory training for all frontline staff, centered on respect, sensitivity, and veteran awareness. But that wasn't where the story ended. Colonel Jonathan Connelly, usually reserved, focused strictly on duty, did something out of character. He spoke out, not just as an officer but as a son. In a rare public interview broadcast nationwide, he let down his guard. My father never asked to be treated like a hero. He never expected special treatment. But he deserved dignity. Every veteran does, Jonathan said. If we've reached a point where we can't recognize the quiet sacrifices of the men and women who carried this country on their backs, then maybe we've forgotten what they carried it for. His words stirred something deep across the nation. Lawmakers took notice. Veteran advocacy groups launched new petitions. Less than a week later, the Department of Transportation announced a sweeping review of how airlines treated elderly and veteran passengers, starting with a policy shift allowing carry-on exceptions for veterans traveling with military honors. Back in Virginia, Frank was still getting used to the attention. He never liked being fussed over. When reporters asked how he felt, he simply said, "I just wanted to get to my reunion in one piece." He didn't expect what followed. Letters began arriving by the dozens. Handwritten notes, printed emails, crayon drawings from children, cards from fellow veterans who saw themselves in his story. Most of them began the same way. "Dear Sergeant Connelly, I never knew you, but I owe you." One came from a woman in Ohio. Her father had served in the same division during Korea. Another came from a school teacher in Idaho who used Frank's story to teach her fifth graders about respect and honor. Some letters made Frank laugh. Others brought tears. One stood out, a short note written in unsteady pencil by an 8-year-old. "Thank you for being brave. I want to be like you." Frank read that note over and over again, sitting on his front porch one quiet afternoon. The sun warmed the wood planks beneath his feet. He didn't care about politics. He never sought recognition. But something had come back to him that day. Not fame, not pride, but something gentler, something stronger, a sense of belonging. He sat there on the porch of his modest home in rural Virginia, with the morning light touching his face. The old duffel bag rested at his side as always. The canvas was still creased with time, but now, finally, it was treated with reverence. Not just by him, but by the world. His hand moved across the surface, slowly as his thoughts drifted. Not to medals, not to uniforms, not even to the folded flags, but to the faces, the ones he'd carried with him. Always. Lucky, Mason, Sergeant Kelly. The names of those who didn't come back and of those who did changed, broken in ways no one could see. Some came home missing more than limbs. They came home missing parts of their soul, fragments of their spirit that never quite found their way back. He understood now, with more clarity than ever before, that true respect wasn't tied to the shine of ribbons on a chest or the weight of stars on a shoulder. Respect was forged in something quieter, deeper, shared values, sacrifice, duty, humility. It lived in the ordinary lives of those who carried unseen burdens without needing anyone to notice. "I wasn't the only one who served," he once told Jonathan, his voice steady, not proud, just honest. "Your mother served, waiting." There was meaning in that waiting, in every sleepless night, in every half-finished letter. Neighbors served too, sending packages, checking in, praying. And now he realized service had taken on new forms, not in foxholes or trenches anymore, but in daily kindness, how we speak, how we care, how we show up for each other. He started noticing them everywhere. People you pass by and never ask a single question. A janitor with a stiff gait and an old wound tucked beneath his work shirt. A grocery store clerk with steady hands that once stitched up soldiers under fire. A bus driver who once navigated hostile terrain, now calmly ferrying children to school each day, his past tucked away behind the wheel. No medals, no headlines, just quiet strength. The truth struck him. Heroes don't always look the part. In dignity, it never announces itself. It stands in silence, hoping someone, anyone, might take the time to see deeper, to ask the story, to honor the weight carried. And now it's your turn. Who do you know who's lived a quiet life of service? A family member? A neighbor? Maybe someone you barely knew but witnessed doing something quietly extraordinary. Maybe they never asked for thanks. Maybe they never said a word, but they served. We invite you to share their story below in your own words, however small it may seem. Because sometimes the smallest stories carry the greatest weight. Let's honor the quiet ones, the ones who never sought recognition, only understanding. And if this story reached something in you, if you believe that veterans deserve more than a polite round of applause, that they deserve dignity, change, and real recognition, then give this video a like. Subscribe for more stories like this, stories that pull us back to what truly matters. And share it with someone who needs reminding that remembrance isn't just a date on the calendar. It's a decision we make every day when we see someone who gave and choose to give back in return. Thank you for watching.